I don't know of anything else like this book. Chapters on the existence of God, the absurdity of life without God, faith and reason, the problem of historical knowledge, discussions of the historical Jesus, the problem of miracles, and so forth. I don't know of anything else that puts all of this material at this level into one volume the way Reasonable Faith does.
This is Reasonable Faith, Conversations with Dr. William Lane Craig. I'm Kevin Harris, and whether you're listening on radio or podcast, we'd like to welcome you to Reasonable Faith. We think you'll find the topics we discuss on this show to be fascinating and enriching wherever you are on your personal journey. William Lane Craig is a noted philosopher, scholar, theologian, and speaker, and on Reasonable Faith, he addresses the big questions of life. And while you're listening, let me remind you of the terrific resources available at reasonablefaith.org. There you'll find Dr. Craig's articles and books, audio and video of Dr. Craig's debates and speeches at universities all over the world, and a section featuring answers to the questions that you send to us. You'll also find past podcasts, a discussion forum, and audio from Dr. Craig's Defenders class. All this and more at reasonablefaith.org. Check it out today.
The third edition of the book, Reasonable Faith, Hitting Bookshelves, from Dr. William Lane Craig. And Dr. Craig, in the third edition, usually what you want to do is, expand on some themes, go back and correct some typos. What do you want to do?
Well, I'm pleased to say that there's very little correction that goes on in the third edition. Very few retractions of anything I said, which is nice. That's gratifying. But what there is a lot of updating. It's updated in light of, for example, the attacks of the new atheists. I interact with people like Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and others. It also updates the cosmological information. Lots of new work has been done on the origin of the universe and on subjects like the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. Also updating on work on the historical Jesus and the recent developments in New Testament scholarship. So almost every chapter of the book has been significantly updated to bring it right into conversation with current literature. In addition to that, there is some expansion of the book. The original Reasonable Faith defended only one argument for God's existence. Although it historically surveyed about 5, it only defended the Kalam cosmological argument. In the new edition, I've added defenses of all of the different arguments that were surveyed in the historical survey section. I'm convinced that all of these arguments are good, and therefore it provides a much more well-rounded and robust defense of arguments for the existence of God. We have deleted one chapter from the book. There was a chapter in the second edition written by Craig Blomberg on the historical reliability of the New Testament. And although this is a fine chapter, Craig did a good job on that, nevertheless, I did not want that chapter in the book because I felt it wasn't relevant to the argument of the book. But the editors at the press more or less said, you have to have a chapter in here on this subject. And so I had Craig Blomberg write that chapter, but it was really kind of a fifth wheel. It didn't advance the argument, or it wasn't necessary for the argument of the overall book. So in the third edition, to keep the book down to size or manageable in size, we've deleted that chapter by Craig Blomberg. So those are some of the revisions that are in the third edition.
You mentioned the new atheism. I just want to remind people that we have a resource on that. We've done a couple of broadcasts on the new atheism, why they're called the new atheism, and who's involved, and so on. So I'm going to refer people to that. What level would you say that this book is?
Well, to be honest, I guess I would have to say it would be upper classmen, university undergraduates. As much as I would like lay people to read this, I think unless they're university graduates, or unless you're a student where you're a junior or senior at the university, it's probably not the book to begin with. But if you've already wet your teeth on some other apologetics works and you're familiar with apologetic arguments in philosophy and science and history, then this would be a good next intermediate step. So it would be an intermediate step on the way toward actually reading real scholarship,
One of the expansions in the third edition is the ontological argument. So I know that recently you seem to have been working on that some more. It seems to have come back into prominence. My reading of the literature is that a lot of people think that it's been dispelled and is not even worth arguing. Apparently that's not the case.
I think you're right. That isn't the case. It shouldn't be the case. I once had that attitude myself, that the argument really was not a good argument because there was no way to show that the existence of God is in fact possible, and that therefore you couldn't make a good case for God's existence. But it seems to me that, in fact, on the basis of not only our sort of philosophical intuitions about what is possible and impossible, but also on the basis of experiential considerations, that we do have good grounds for saying that it's possible that God exists. And the remarkable feature of this argument, as it's been developed by people like Alvin Plantinga, is that it shows that if it's possible that God exists, then it does follow that God exists. And I think that that alone is enough to shake up many atheists. Many atheists would be willing to say it's possible that God exists, even though I don't think that he does. But what the ontological argument shows minimally is that if it's possible that God exists, then God in fact does exist. So that puts the atheist in the uncomfortable position of having to say it's impossible for there to be God, which is pretty radical.
I don't want people to be intimidated by the ontological argument. It can be intimidating, but it is fascinating, very rewarding to study. There's something about it. And first of all, that's a big word, ontological. So what do we mean by that?
Well, it comes from the Greek word ontos, which means being or reality. And so it's an attempt to argue for the being or the reality of God from the very concept of God, that once you understand who God is, or you understand the concept of God, then you'll see that there has to be such an entity corresponding to that concept in reality. And I want to second what you just said about the benefits of just reflecting on the ontological argument. Whether you think it's a good argument or not, I think that it does serve to magnify the concept of God and to exalt our understanding of who God is. God is not a being who just sort of happens to exist. He doesn't just happen to be there. Rather, God is a metaphysically necessary being. He is a being whose non-existence is impossible. And so, reflecting on the ontological argument, I think, has great theological value in deepening our appreciation of who God is and what he's like.
You also expanded some of the historical Jesus material. Tell us about some of the expansion there.
When I wrote the second edition of Reasonable Faith, it was very widely believed among New Testament scholars that the historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, never claimed to be the Messiah or the Son of God or the Son of Man, that these were titles written back into the Gospels by the early church long after Jesus was dead and gone. That has changed now in contemporary scholarship. Today, a good many scholars are quite ready to argue that the historical Jesus did think that he was the Jewish Messiah, that he really believed this, that he thought he was the Messiah, that he thought he was the Son of God, and that he thought he was the Son of Man, prophesied by the prophet Daniel in the 7th chapter of Daniel's prophecy. And so the third edition of Reasonable Faith contains a very detailed defense of the historical Jesus's self-understanding as the Jewish Messiah, the Son of God, and the Son of Man. And I look at not only New Testament materials, but also very interesting materials from the Dead Sea Scrolls and other what are called pseudepigraphal Jewish writings. These are Jewish writings in between the Old and the New Testament that reveal to us a lot of the Jewish religious thinking in the era preceding Jesus' advent on this earth. And I think these show and make it very plausible that Jesus of Nazareth did have this sort of exalted self-understanding.
Bill, there are a lot of Bible-believing Christians who would sit here and hear you say that and go, well, of course, Jesus claimed all that. And of course, this is the Word of God. It's the inspired Word of God and so on. But when you're doing this kind of work, you're surveying and looking at scholarship and historical arguments in order to at least have some minimal information in order to build your case or to show where the scholarship actually supports that very contention.
That's the key distinction, I think, Kevin, is that there's a difference between believing that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah and thought he was the Son of God, and saying that historical scholarship can actually show that Jesus thought and believed these things. And my claim is the second one, which is I think, very exciting and can serve to undergird and support one's faith.
Any new material on the resurrection in this edition?
What I primarily do there is interact with recent books on the resurrection that have been written. Since Reasonable Faith was published, there hasn't been any new discoveries pertinent to the resurrection per se, but there have been some important books published on it. So I interact, for example, with the work of John Meyer, who is probably the preeminent historical Jesus scholar today. I interact with the work of N.T. Wright, who has written a massive book, some 800 pages, called The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is probably the most important book on the resurrection today. And then I interact with the work of Dale Allison, a fine New Testament scholar, who, although he believes in the historicity of the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus and the origin of the Christian faith, presents what I think is the most compelling negative case against the resurrection, a case that he in the end finds unconvincing, but nevertheless is very compellingly presented. And so I interact in this chapter with the work of all three of those men.
So you certainly didn't skirt the hard questions.
Not at all. No, The Reasonable Faith, I think, is an honest book. It takes on the best and the brightest on the other side. So in dealing with, for example, the atheistic arguments, I don't content myself with dealing with arguments from popularizers like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. I take on people like Graham Oppy and J. Howard Sobel and Michael Martin's contributors to his Cambridge Companion to Atheism. These are the high-level atheists of our day, and I take them on squarely in the book.
In light of some best-selling books recently, I think that this third edition sounds like it's going to serve a real purpose in looking at things concerning the historical Jesus, including some work by Bart Ehrman, which calls into question.
Yes, I forgot to mention him. He's in there too.
Oh, yes, yeah. And also there was a movie documentary that the tomb of Jesus had been found. And so in light of all these things that have infiltrated the culture, misquoting Jesus, again, that sold a lot of books. I mean, that was
Ehrman's
surprising.
the best-selling religious author at Oxford University Press.
Yeah. And it just really devastates the case for the Bible, the case for Christ, and so on. And so in light of that, seems like some of this material may shed some light on some of this.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know of anything else like this book, Kevin, quite honestly. You can read individual critiques that have this material in it. For example, Craig Evans' work in his popular book called Fabricating Jesus is a great critique of those who think that Jesus of Nazareth didn't have any exalted self-concept. But Evans' book is confined to the historical Jesus. It doesn't include chapters on the existence of God, the absurdity of life without God, faith and reason, the problem of historical knowledge. You can find books on the existence of God that have very able defenses of, say, the Leibnizian cosmological argument. Tim O'Connor has a new book on this, so does Alexander Pruss. But those books won't include discussions of the historical Jesus, the problem of miracles, and so forth. I don't know of anything else that puts all of this material at this level into one volume the way Reasonable Faith does.
Reasonable Faith is the name of the book. This is the third edition. It's from Crossway Books. Mm-hmm. Did you expand the design argument? Any new material coming in on that?
Yeah, it's got a long section in there on the argument from fine-tuning for the origin of the universe, and some very interesting recent developments with regard to the so-called multiverse hypothesis. People try to subvert the design argument by saying that there is a multiverse out there, that is to say, a kind of world ensemble of parallel universes that we can't see.
We're just one among many universes.
That's exactly right. One universe among many, and these are randomly ordered in their constants and quantities, so that by chance alone, somewhere in this infinite ensemble, our universe would appear. And lucky us, here we are. And that argument is taken by many to be the sort of last line of defense against the inference to an intelligent designer of the cosmos. And in the book, I give several reasons as to why that multiverse hypothesis really doesn't work in explaining away the fine-tuning of the universe.
Robin Collins is a scholar really known in this area. He really denounces the multiverse theory as well, doesn't he?
Yes, he does present arguments against the multiverse, but then Robin goes even farther, and he argues that even if there is a multiverse, you still can't explain away fine-tuning or avoid a designer. So that he shows that we can be quite willing to accommodate a multiverse, and the design argument will still go through. He has a wonderful argument, for example, based upon the laws of nature, which will govern the multiverse, and how the laws of nature themselves point to a designer of the universe. Now, Robin Collins' work is not yet available except in article form, but his main book, called A Well-Tempered Universe, is still being written and probably won't appear for another year or so. But I have been personally in conversation with Robin now for some time and profited a great deal from his insights in this area, and that has helped me to write this chapter.
Bill, I've got a stack of papers right here in front of me, and it's questions that you receive via email through the reasonablefaith.org website, reasonablefaith.org. And there are a lot of questions in here. I see a pattern here on your view of the inner witness of the Spirit, which you begin Reasonable Faith, the second edition with.
That's right, in the Faith and Reason chapter.
Have you found that a lot of people, aside from these emails here, ask just what does that mean?
I find that a lot of people don't understand it, unfortunately. I'm often amazed, Kevin, at the questions that come into reasonablefaith.org for the lack of understanding of these views. I think that sometimes people, particularly unbelievers, look at the surface of something, and if they don't like the way it sounds, they just immediately reject it. They just shut off. And they never seek to try to really understand the view and to really explore what it means. Because if they did, I think they would see that these initial first impression reactions are quite misconceived and based on misunderstandings. So in the third edition, I do deal with the question of what happens when a person who claims to know that Christianity is true on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit finds himself confronted with a Mormon who claims to know that Mormonism is true based upon the burning he feels in his bosom. And does this result in a kind of epistemic standoff, a stalemate? And I argue that it doesn't. And I hope that those who have rejected this view in the past will look at that more carefully and reconsider it, because I think that it really does make the best sense.
Thank you, Dr. Craig, for spending some time with us, and thank you, the listener, for being here today. This podcast is available at reasonablefaith.org, as well as a wealth of audio, video, and written materials from William Lane Craig. People all over the world have benefited from the insights of Dr. Craig, and we invite you to browse our resources at reasonablefaith.org. And when you give to Reasonable Faith or purchase our resources, you help us expand into more media and speaking events, taking Christ to a world of big questions. So be sure and visit us at reasonablefaith.org. I'm Kevin Harris. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Reasonable Faith with William Lane Craig.